whether or not he gave it the same significance, as everyone else was of no consequence to me. He just was. Where I came from, my name meant something to the community. It was respected and had a certain dignity that everyone regarded very highly. It wasn't pretentious or conceited because we did something meaningful with it. We were doctors and lawyers, and the money we acquired was only as respected as what we used it for. For generations, we donated and built philanthropic ties across the globe to make a difference and change the world with a single, two-syllable name. Just as it was when my family immigrated to this country centuries ago, and just as it was when I was a child, a boy on his father's knee, eager to hear the tale of our name once more, and pass it along to future generations. My father perished long before he could see his dreams come to fruition, but the two children I had brought into my home, and privilege with that name, would always know one solid fact, if nothing else. The Cullens were men of distinction. It probably sounded much like an overabundance of expectation to impart on two boys, but I never really regarded it this way. I had seen something in both Emmett and Edward that was prevalent in all Cullen men, and this was the singular reason I had seated to mentor and guide them under my name. They were both men of distinction as well. Emmett was extroverted in his strength and energy, and though many never saw his other qualities, he was also compassionate and almost regal in his exuberance to protect the ones he loved. He could bring a smile to anyone who submitted to his charm and outgoing personality. He didn't need to become a doctor or a lawyer to change the world, though I was confident he would be successful doing either. It was my belief he would change the world with his kindness, smile, and conservative brawn. Edward was dissimilar from Emmett. From the first night I spoke with him in the hospital, it was obvious he was a very introverted and analytical-minded person. He examined everything closely and used his findings to build his judgments and feelings based upon observation and his own personal beliefs. He was also clearly a very selfless individual, sharp and defensive of what he cared about. But Edward's most admirable quality must have been his passionately fierce loyalty. It was a subtle trait because he rarely allowed anyone to grow close enough to grant it. Being so fiercely loyal was a duty he didn't take lightly or bestow upon just anyone. With Edward, this privilege was earned. He would change the world with his intellect, sacrificing nature, and unwavering devotion to his principles and integrity. He was a Cullen because I saw these characteristics in him, and knew he was meant for something truly great. But he took 10 strides back after that night. He refused to allow me any entrance into his privacy, and though I didn't regret my attempt, I did feel awful for the counterproductive response. I wanted to apologize and show him the significance of his place in my home. He wasn't a project for me. There were times I feared he may have felt this way, because I often found it difficult to traverse the line between what I desired for our relationship and what he would willingly allow. So, I ordered the seal that night from a special location in London, where my family frequently had such things forged. It was an apology and a promise, all wrapped up into a 1.5-inch disc. The morning I had discovered it arrived, I was anxious and impatient to give it to him. I knew he'd likely resist any gift that felt intimate or familial, so I had resigned myself to leaving it somewhere he couldn't immediately return it to me. My shift was going to start shortly after I found the package in the foyer, and it was still early enough that the sun had yet to rise, so I made a last-minute decision that proved to be fairly pivotal in this whole situation. At the time, it seemed like a good idea to sneak into his room and leave it atop his dresser while he was sleeping. I figured he'd wake up and find it there, and though he'd be curious, he couldn't immediately refuse it. Instead, he'd simply keep it somewhere safe until our bond had grown enough for him to feel comfortable granting it the proper significance it was intended. His bedroom door was locked, and it seemed so metaphorical for Edward that I nearly snorted as I hunted down the spare key to his bedroom in my keyring and slid it into the lock quietly. The room was dark and obscure, and I prayed he had kept it clean as I felt my way across the carpet blindly to his dresser, in a bit of a hurry to depart for my shift. It had been so long since I had entered his room that I had to dig into the recesses of my memory to even recall the dresser's location. I was quiet and fluid in my movements, and just as I pulled the disc from my pocket, I was met with an ear-piercing shriek that made me jump and cringe as I covered my ears instinctively. The scream was feminine, and it took a couple moments, but the room was eventually illuminated in the soft light from his lamp. To say I was stunned by what greeted my eyes would have been an egregious understatement. Edward was squinting as I stared wide-eyed at him in the bed, and at his side was none other than a hysterical and screaming Bella Swan. My jaw went slack as he swiftly made to come her, and my eyes began finally absorbing my surroundings. There were clothes just all over the floor around the bed, some his and some hers, and by the time my gaze finally wandered to the condom wrapper upon the table at his bedside, I was torn between two completely contradicting emotions. Absolute horror and quite oddly total amusement. As he held her, I felt my lips twitch involuntarily. It was such a normal infraction for a boy his age that I couldn't help the instinct to feel somewhat relieved. Edward rarely did anything normal, and seeing him in that position, a teenage boy being caught in bed with his girlfriend, actually made me feel like his awkward, horror-stricken father for once. And if it were anyone other than her, I might have chuckled and fled the room to plot various methods of embarrassing him about it in the future, much like I would have done with Emmett if it were him and Rosalie. But it was Bella for Christ's sake, and she was in no position to be taken advantage of. Her condition was serious, and being voluntarily neglected by her own ignorant decisions. It was so unbelievably careless for him to even be considering intercourse with her that horror quickly became my paramount emotion, and all amusement and relief was swiftly lost as I realized the gravity of the situation. I stared at the disc in my hand as I sighed deeply, and felt regret for handling it as I did. I should have kept it to myself, and simply had the lattice removed to prevent any further sleepovers. I should have taken them aside on my own, and explained why it was wrong. I should have informed and educated them on the risks, and led them to the proper course of conducting such a fragile relationship. I shouldn't have given Esme the opportunity to overreact and cast light on all of our imperfections as well. Maybe it was better that those imperfections were finally revealed, but as I dropped my hand and stared at the ceiling, I had difficulty deciding what to regret anymore. I knew I may regret leaving Esme in the harsh light of morning, but I also knew with a painful certainty she'd never come to see me as anything more than a lengthy tryst. Just as I knew it was possible Edward may never come to see me as anything more than a legal benefactor. As I gazed up at my white ceiling dismally, I spent many moments finally abandoning the impossible ideals I had set for them both. Esme would never be my wife, and Edward would never be my son. I had to accept responsibility for even allowing an ocean to grow to such fantastic proportions in my mind. I reluctantly let the vision slip away behind my eyes, and resigned myself to reality for once as I returned the disc to my pocket, and rolled on my side once again. It still pushed into my thigh, and I used the sensation to distract myself from the painful ache of loss in my chest as I surrendered to the chanting truth that penetrated my dreams. Esme would never be my wife, and Edward would never be my son. The darkness of night and solitude of my bare room consoled my defeat, and reminded me that it wasn't possible to lose a family I never actually had. The next 3 weeks were painfully slow and tedious with patience and boring routines. In an effort to keep myself constantly occupied, I nearly picked up an extra shift at the hospital before I thought better of it. Edward had been deteriorating further, and I was reconciled to keeping a close eye on his physical health where I could manage. He had lost too much weight over the last month for my comfort. I knew he hadn't been sleeping much, and though the thought of sleep deprivation was frightening, there was little I could do. I had considered my alternatives, but he was already a legal adult, and therefore left solely responsible for his own medical decisions. It wasn't possible to defy his will if he didn't seek out treatment on his own unless he proved himself legally incompetent to form such decisions. This would never happen, because Edward was nothing if not completely competent. I wanted to take the car from him because I seriously doubted his ability to operate it under proper alert awareness. But I have used the car as punishment and leverage in the past, and I refused to go the route of Esme, taking away everything he desired and insisting it was for his own good. I couldn't kick him while he was down, and I kept reminding myself he rarely drove, and had done so under similar conditions in the past. It didn't always put my worries at ease. I felt desperately compelled to tell him it wasn't me who so callously rejected his relationship with Bella, but it wouldn't have done any good, and I couldn't bear to think of the chasm it would create between her and Esme when he inevitably explained the situation in greater detail. So I kept my mouth shut, and acted the other half of the cruel parental force that was keeping them apart. This made the weeks more difficult and anxiety-ridden as I kept a close eye where I could. He only emerged from his room in the mornings for school, and at nights to eat or play video games with Emmett. They probably thought I couldn't hear them from my room, but I could as I lay in the dark, forcing my thoughts away from the woman next door. She never called or attempted to see me, and with every passing day I became simultaneously relieved and disappointed with her lack of effort. So I kept myself occupied with hospital affairs and my own worries over Edward, resigned to going through these motions, until something I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, but I knew I was waiting for something to happen. Maybe I was waiting for the call from Esme, maybe I was waiting for Edward to finally forgive me. I was simply waiting, and I had no idea what I was waiting for. It reminded me of my favorite particular cookie of Bella's, strawberry standstills. I was definitely at a standstill. Eventually, I stopped receiving cookies altogether, and I couldn't determine if it was Bella's ire with me, or Esme's that halted their appearance in my foyer every morning. It didn't matter. My troubles greatly exceeded the trivial woe of my lack of baked goods, and I used these truths to distract myself from the fact that everyone likely loved me. The nights crawled by slowly in my study as I finished paperwork and researched what I could on sleep deprivation and nightmares, so I could better care for Edward. If I looked hard enough, I supposed I could see the signs were always present. Since the day I met him in the hospital, and he refused the sedatives, he had always been eluding sleep. I couldn't decide how I had managed to completely overlook something so critical since day one. Edward did a successful job of hiding it, that much was certain, but it didn't excuse my error. Maybe my smug nature as an established physician granted me some kind of false faith in my skills of observation. It had never crossed my mind that I might be dealing with something greater than the mere trauma of his burn scars. Unlike with Emmett, I had little history of Edward's past. I knew his scars well because I had treated him repeatedly for various illnesses over the years, and though I knew this by record, I had no specifics other than a brief mention that his father had perished. I was granted his medical history, but hardly alluded to anything particular to the event, other than his diagnosis and treatment. And the wards of the state, similar to Emmett's adoption, only allowed me limited information on his mother, since he was surrendered to their custody via an anonymous source. I accepted the responsibility, and scanned information in hopes that Edward might fill in the blanks for me once we grew close, since he had been an older child at the time he was surrendered. Of course, this never happened, and I had never considered underlying and unrelated issues that were likely festering since God knows when. The day I brought him at home, when he was an overactive 8-year-old boy, I had gained some experience in dealing with underlying conditions. Emmett was a poster child for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and required much attention for our interim years together. And though he eventually lacked the need for his medication, since he found an athletic outlet for his abundance of energy, I still filled the Adderall prescriptions and remained vigilant of his excellent progress. This was what I did. I observed and tracked progress, and corrected where I could manage. But it wasn't so easy with Edward. The research on sleep disorders didn't ease my fears, and the further I delved into the subject, the more panicked I grew over what Edward was subjecting his body to. Sleep deprivation was frightening, and could be fatal. The human body could be deprived of sleep for no more than approximately 10 days. I had no way of determining how much he slept or how much sleep that he had acquired since that morning, but the facts alarmed me. In all my years in practice, I hadn't experienced voluntarily induced sleep deprivation. I had mild cases of such things under my belt. They were usually stress-induced and caused my patients to become restless. I'd prescribe them a sedative and recommend a vacation. But the severity was unlike anything I had ever seen. So I had to re-educate myself on the effects. There were health factors that long-term sleep deprivation affected greatly. It reduces constructive thinking skills and emotional intelligence, and though this explained a rather large portion of Edward's major personality flaws, it didn't make me feel any better. As the days passed and I immersed myself further in the topic, it just got worse. Heart failure, stroke, mood disorders, mental impairment, insulin deficiency. The list went on, and these didn't even include the more widely known and equally alarming short-term effects. Much to my surprise, there were even various references to sleep